So I'm going to share my screen and press on and wish you all welcome. Thank you very much for coming. And just to remind everyone that we are recording this session and it will be published later. So if you don't want to show your house and garden to the world, now's the time to turn off the camera. We've got this issue. That was a mistake, wasn't it? Let's see if we can move that out of the way. Okay. So hopefully everyone can now see my gloriously designed welcome. Oops, what happened there? Opening screen. And what we're going to talk about today is how you can design insulation directly into your new houses by 3 routes, which I'm going to chat about. And the first thing I say is that the modern management techniques say you never ever use bullet points on a PowerPoint slide if you are using PowerPoint, but you should stop using bullet points. So I thought I'd just make the point by leaving plenty of blank bullet points in to fill in. But I want to just remind people what PassivHaus standards are for building. Then we can discuss earth-sheltered houses and dome houses as other ways of getting to the same sort of levels. Then we can talk about how we can enforce this in our local communities. And just to satisfy everyone's desires, I'll give some examples of where it's happening. So the beauty of PassivHaus is that the buildings are created to standards so that they maintain an almost constant temperature without any external need for heat. So they're designed, insulated, and ventilated so that the heat of the bodies of the people in the house is usually all that you need to keep the house warm. And that's obviously going to get more and more important as energy gets more and more expensive or scarce or less reliable if it's developed from renewable means. So there's no particular construction methods that you have to use, but you have to meet the common features of much greater insulation than is typical. And we started the meeting today with somebody saying they got 300 millimeters of insulation all over their house. So we'll see how that compares with PassivHaus. More than 20 times the air tightness levels than you get in most UK houses. But that means you've got to have a ventilation system that keeps the air circulating just to make sure that there's fresh air coming into the house through all that air tightness. And the point is you really don't need a conventional heating system. So the amount of energy that you're using just to keep the house warm is close to zero. And in fact, we're saying here that it actually only kicks in when the temperature drops below freezing. Then there's a sentence, I picked up this from somebody else's website, that a PassivHaus will also need to have a mechanism to heat water, which could be solar heating or an air source heat pump. But of course, for most people, it's just an immersion heater, but it's still electricity. So if your electricity is green, then we're helping the climate. So just some examples of PassivHaus being built in large numbers. So I like Primrose Park very much in Plymouth because they're all designed to be affordable. So certainly where I live at the moment, we have major issues with developers building developments that have very minimal numbers of affordable housing. And one of the things we want to talk about today is how you can raise those numbers and oblige the developer to meet your requirements rather than he just saying, this is what we will build because this is what we're going to make the money on. So anyway, there's somebody in Plymouth saying that they only spend £1.40 a day on gas and electric. And I don't know whether they've actually sorted that out from cooking or from heating or quite how they meant that, but it's not a large number compared to what some of us are paying. And I love this story, which came from somebody in Exeter, where Exeter has been building a lot of their houses to PassivHaus standards. And somebody came by a year later to ask, how has it been? And one of the questions they asked is, anyone had to come and do anything to maintain or fix the building? And the answer was, well, the first winter we moved in, we didn't have any heating at all, but we didn't know we didn't have heating. And what gave them the clue was the condensation on the windows, and they shouldn't have condensation. So when the engineers came over, they were able to say to the people in the house, well, the problem with the condensation is you haven't got any heating running. But the interesting thing is that the people had no idea that they didn't have their heating on because they hadn't noticed it in terms of the temperature. So PassivHaus is one way to go to get your houses efficiently heated and to reduce the energy consumption. Then there's earth sheltered houses, and people tend to get the wrong ideas when you say, you know, we've got an underground house. So we don't mean anybody in the left-hand picture, nor do we mean people in the right-hand picture, nor actually do we mean this, but we are getting close to it now, so that there's some gorgeous underground houses or earth-sheltered houses, so you don't get the sensation that you are underground necessarily. You can design it in a space where it's more or less invisible to passers-by, which I think is very appealing. So people driving past on the road outside, all they see is a hump of grass. They don't see the house underneath at all. And all that grass and earth is providing you with a lot of insulation against the weather. So just to show you how much, you can see vast piles of earth will be bulldozed back against this house to provide the insulation that it needs. And the building of the house itself is not particularly expensive. So you're going to put a domed roof in because it needs the strength to hold up that amount of weight. It's covered in a waterproof membrane, which gives you the protection from any rain or other source of water. And the houses that you put into earth sheltered houses tend to be remarkably quiet because, again, you've got a lot of earth between you and the noise outside. The beauty is much the same as the passive house, that the temperature very rarely varies. And of the side that is exposed to the weather, you can put in plenty of triple glazing. So low heating and cooling costs. You can reduce the cost of building the house by building it where nobody else could put up a conventional building. So if you're on a steep slope, that's ideal from the point of view of somebody who wants to build an earth sheltered house. And a builder wouldn't want to spend all the money on flattening the ground to put in a conventional building. So there are some downsides to building an underground house, in that historically you've got to have somebody who knows what they're doing and is paying attention to it. There have been plenty of issues of people having trouble because the builder didn't pay attention to what the design said, and the design itself had to be appropriate to the occasion. So the third way I wanted to suggest to people were dome houses. And I find that people miss the major point of dome houses, which is the use of materials, using minimal amounts of material to achieve the same effect as you get with much more. And the way this was put to me was the dome houses were originally, the first one was designed by an American called Buckminster Fuller. And he said, if you think about materials, engineers tend to measure them in their terms of their strength. They have a compression strength and they have a tensile strength. And the tension strength is very much greater than the compression strength. And so it would be more efficient to use your materials in tension rather than compression. But he said, how do we build houses? We plonk brick upon brick upon brick, which is just a compression system. So if you can design your house so that all the materials are in tension, you're making much more efficient use of them. You can reduce the amount of material you need to get the same degree of shelter and protection. and you can put the extra money that you saved into getting the insulation right from the start. So dome houses come in all sorts of designs. They're cheap to build and they're very easy to insulate, as you'll see later on. So given those three types of housing, which are very good ways of reducing the amount of energy that your houses are using, then how do you make sure that you get that sort of house built? Well, fortunately, the new NPPF that came in at the start of this year gives much more weight to neighborhood plans. So when you're redesigning your neighborhood plan, it has to fall in line with your local planning authority or with the local plan. But once it's been approved, then the new law requires that the overall planning authority, your council, your county council, or your unity authority, has to pay heed to what your neighborhood plan says. So if you've stated that all new builds have to be built to, say, PassivHaus standards, and the planning authority approved that neighborhood plan, then all your new builds will indeed have to be built to that standard. And there are plenty of communities who are doing that now. So I've put a couple of examples in there for you. Part L of the building regulations was revised a couple of years ago to start developers moving towards what will be the future home standard next year. I don't think the standards have been actually finalized yet for this new future home standard, and I suspect it isn't going to be as high as PassivHaus. So although the overall country is moving towards better standards for insulation, and it's worth pointing out that 40% of our CO2 equivalent emissions are coming from our either building industry or the installed buildings that we have in the UK at the moment. So that's a large impact will be had if you can reduce the emissions of houses on an individual basis. So I would suggest that it's now worthwhile rewriting your neighborhood plans so they put in a specific requirement for the standard of insulation that they're going to have, the standard of emissions that they're going to have, and also slip in there what percentage of affordable housing you want to have in any new development, because I guarantee that what your community needs and what you want will be a lot higher percentage of affordable housing than the developer will say that you need. So he would like it to be a low number. You would probably like it to be much higher, a larger number. But if you state it in your neighborhood plan and it's been approved by a local authority, then that's what you'll have to get in the future. So just to conclusions on what we're talking about today, by far the least expensive way to heat a home is to get its insulation right from the start. Interestingly, the cost of a passive house or a dome house or a sheltered house is not necessarily any greater than a conventional home would be in the same place. Now, obviously, there are variations depending on the quality of the land and what you're doing and where you're doing it, but as by and large, it isn't going to cost you a lot more money to get the home insulation correct from the start. So I'm suggesting these are the routes that we could follow to start improving our standards around the country. And I just thought that to show people that housing doesn't have to look as if it is an underground house or a dome house, there are some examples to cheer you up. So here's a multiple underground house or earth sheltered housing unit, in this case in Switzerland. Here's the first one ever built in the UK, which is now 55 years old. But one of the appeals of this is, of course, you've got all that decoration of the grass around the housing. It's very difficult to say that this is a house here, weren't it not for the glass. And the top left corner, I think, is particularly appealing, the front door. But walking to the front door, you're basically walking through the countryside. But once you get inside, there's no limit to how exciting your design can be. So by and large, I've always found that underground houses are actually brighter and lighter than their standard conventional equivalent. Much more emphasis put on getting the light right in the first place. So a couple more examples around the country. This, I guarantee you, is not in our country, but it is in the country. And just to show you that you don't have to be limited nowadays in your thinking of what you do if you're going underground, nor if you're building a dome house. So I put this picture in to show you the structure of the dome house. You notice that the pentagons on each dome, if you will, are all beams that are held in tension with each other. So that the material that you put between them can be very taut and very thin, but you get the strength from the tension, from the tensile strength of the material. The other thing about dome houses is that you can build them in modules, and the module can be as either just one of those triangles or the whole pentagon as a piece, depending on whether you want to be using a crane or not. But a lot of people are building these houses on their own now, so hugely reducing the costs. And as we move more and more towards module production of things, then you just have the module drive up on the back of the lorry, you crane it into place, and your house is built in a day or two. So I love this picture. It's like being inside a cathedral, but just shows you one of the advantages of dome houses, of course, is you don't need interior walls because the external strength of the house is coming from the skeleton, if you will, rather than the interior walls. There's a slight disadvantage that your furniture may fit better if it's curved, but not everything is curved. And just my last picture is to show you that Seaton Beach has built the first multi-residential passive house in the country, and very affordable, very popular. And of course, it just fits in beautifully with the housing on either side. It meets all standards for maintaining the integrity of the style of your area. No change at all. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation for today. I'll stop sharing the screen and see if anyone wants to make any comments. Yep, Stuart, you're off to a good start.
Sorry, I got several sort of comments to make, but I'll stick to just one. And that is the biggest problem we've got in this country is older houses. I gather there are something like 30 million dwellings in the country. If we're going to retrofit them, if they do one retrofit every minute of every day of every year, it will take about 60 years to do. So do you have any solutions to what we should do with the existing housing stock?
No, this today's presentation was purely on the new housing stock because I was very antagonized by the idea that new houses that we're building today, if you build them towards today's regulations, then the chances are you're going to have to retrofit them before 2050 to meet the 2050 standards. And I think that's daft. So I just wanted to get local communities moving on any new builds, at least being fit for 2050.
I quite agree with that.
I agree that by far the larger problem is in retrofitting. And I think that's a topic that I ought to find somebody who's much more familiar with the issue and much more knowledgeable to present to us, because it is, as you say, by far the larger requirement is to retrofit.
Graham, when you say built to passive house standards, is that just using the passive house standard, or does that include passive house certification?
I think when includes certification, yes.
Okay.
I think really it was the degree of ventilation, the degree of air tightness, the degree of insulation is what I'm looking to get people to build to in the future.
So I've been to 5 or 6 passive homes to have a look at how they do this, and one of them, they had a leak up in the roof, which was too expensive to rip everything to bits and fix it. So the house was built to passive standards, but it wasn't certified. How would that fit in with your request to have passive house builds?
Well, I think you're correct. I should change the wording to certified because I do think you need to have the certification.
And what would happen if you didn't get it because of some error in the build?
Well, then if you've got your neighborhood plan stating that if they're going to develop in your area, then they need to build to these standards, then you fall back on the usual routine of if you haven't met the standards, then you've got to fix it.
Okay.
Let me move on. I'm hoping I've answered Stuart's questions. Let me move on to Cara, please.
Thanks. Agree with the retrofit, which is super important because we've got more houses exist today than we're ever going to build. So maybe that could be another topic. But some of the great suggestions Graham has made are going to be difficult for volume house building. And I guess that is where it needs to be separated out. That if you're doing individual properties, dome housing underground, brilliant. But for entire neighbourhoods, maybe more challenging. However, to note as well, looking at natural building materials, so there's also cob build, so using earth as a way to actually build the structure of the home from that rather than then covering it in soil for kind of underground version.
On that, Cara. That's good.
Which, you know, it's been a long used building construction method in the Southwest, particularly. That's where I'm based. So I know a lot of them, and there's been some amazing new builds based on that. But again, it's usually quite bespoke, although you can do cob block. So that goes back to the original point of should we be building bricks? But on that notion, straw bale building is another one that has been
yeah, I know,
modernized as well. So there's some really great natural building products that actually we need to be putting more pressure in our neighbourhood plan to request low carbon building materials. So passive house is great. It's very expensive and high embodied energy to build in some cases to those standards. But it might be worth looking at some of the social housing. So I was talking to someone yesterday that is a social housing, could be Hasto, can't remember what they said, that is looking to build passive house standards more affordably. And therefore looking at that kind of multiple builds may be something that's worth looking at. But it can be very challenging to meet passive house standards. And I guess that comes back to your previous point, is what happens if you request that and they can't make it and they don't get certified and they fail to deliver that, whereas what they're trying to achieve is actually quite good. So devil's in the detail, of course. But I'm very passionate about low carbon building materials. And so trying to get more nature-based building materials back into our construction industry, I think is really important.
Yeah, thanks for your links, Cara, because I think they'll be very helpful. And you're quite right. I should cover those cob and straw buildings in my presentation, particularly as I've stayed in this straw bale building. There's one in Langport, which is up for, it's an Airbnb hire. It's rather fun to go and stay in an Airbnb straw building, but you can do that in Langport. So good.
Yeah, there's a number actually, new builds that have used straw bale too, which is really great.
Okay, thank you. Tristram?
Yeah, 2 points. Cara, I quite agree with you about reusable, low carbon materials. And I think particularly timber, we should be building much more in timber. And there is a government push, I think, to encourage timber building and particularly engineered timber, which doesn't rot and is very strong. And of course, takes carbon out of the atmosphere and stores it. And, we create a store of carbon, which could be very useful. But I wanted to come back to Stuart's point about retrofit. Stuart, again, I can't quite remember where the guidance is, but I've read somewhere that we need to be very careful about knocking down buildings and rebuilding buildings to zero carbon standards, because the embodied carbon in that process is enormous. So the advice is the best thing to do with an old building is to retain it and just improve it. The EPC, the 20 million EPC reports in the country, I think they all are required to say, is it viable to get that house back from an E or a D score to a C? And sometimes they say it's not. So if you've got an F score and the assessor reckons it's not worth trying to bring that house up to a level C, you've just got to live with it and do your best and put on more jerseys and accept there's going to be a high heating bill for the foreseeable, well, for the life of the building, which could be 100 or 2 years. Otherwise, buildings which are assessed to be able to get to a grade C or above, there are plenty of retrofit assessors who will provide the advice on how to do that. But again, you'll never get to PassivHaus standards. But I think maybe we shouldn't hurry too much. We just got to say for new builds, we can go to PassivHaus standards. But for existing buildings, we just got to do what's sensible and feasible.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tristan. Morning, Amanda, or afternoon, Amanda.
Good afternoon. I'm wondering which order to start in here. Oh, go on. I'll say the first bit. I'm a maths tutor in my spare time, so I just wanted to say that it wasn't just pentagons in there. That's a combination of pentagons, hexagons, and all sorts of combinations of triangle to make it a 3D shape. So that was my first bit, just being silly. Morton in Marsh is an example where Cotswold District Council have recently developed a small development of eco-friendly houses. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that they were prefabbed, so they're constructed off-site and then brought in and delivered, but they're for social housing. So that's a nice example here in the Cotswolds. And then another point is in relation to building control. It's kind of the point that was already made, but a bit more. I'm in a modern, typically built sort of square house, and all with nice right angles, except for when it isn't. And building control doesn't exist anymore. It's pretty much NHBC paid for by the builders to inspect. So they mark their own homework, basically. So one of the issues that it reminded me to get on record is the whole issue. The system of building control does not mean that it's built to spec and nobody's checking. So when I come in and buy my house, part of the insulation's missing. The airflow doesn't work to the standard that was required when I've had it independently assessed. And there's nobody I can go back to because it's all been done by the builder paying their friends in effect. And I've got no comeback. And then the other was with some of the pictures that you've shown us, which is helpful to visualize. One of my thoughts coming from a AONB meeting yesterday is we have a light pollution statement because we're looking towards dark sky status. And if you've got a lot of glass to get the light in, you're also going to be giving a lot of light out. And I'd like that to be put on record just to bear in mind when designing. Because obviously the sort of people that design and want these houses are the sort of people that will be concerned about issues like that. So I'm sure if you bear it in mind, it can be worked around. So those are my contributions for today. And thank you for the presentation, Graham.
Well, you're very welcome, Amanda. And I think they call those things that prevent the light escaping curtains. And certainly the underground houses I've seen have all got wonderful curtains for doing exactly what you say.
But if you go back to that one you showed us of the multi-story, they didn't have their curtains across, did they?
Well, the Seaton one, do you mean the PassivHaus one in
Yeah.
Seaton? Yeah, well.
If you have a look at that picture again, you'll see just how much light emission was coming out. But, they're probably not in a dark sky status, but I wouldn't have it in the middle of Northumberland National Park, for example.
Right. Noted.
That was my point, is it's houses for places. And, but yes, I think you could do it, but just with more care taken about the type of lighting and where it is direction to and how warm it is, etc. I'm sure it can be done. It's just to bear in mind that it's even more important if you're in an underground house.
If you're still twiddling your thumbs at the moment, Amanda, could you just look up a reference to that Morton in the Marsh development? Stick it in the chat. That would be good.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try and find that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stuart.
Yes, I'll say thanks for the talk. Very interesting. I think another major problem is developers. They will tend to abide by building regs, and building regs are way behind the curve when it comes to climate change. And I was reading the annual report from one of them, I think it's Persimmon, and they actually broke down their new builds by size of house and affordability. And they make far much more money on the big executive houses than they do on the social housing. Therefore, they seem to be very disinclined, and they'll claim non-viability if they have to do too many social housing. That's one thing. The other thing is they have, I think, preset designs. I think most big developers have 4 or 5 different houses, which they dress slightly differently, but they tend not to want to change them at all. I think a lot of the stuff is made off-site, shipped in, and then have cladding and things put on them. The other thing I noted from this annual report was they mentioned putting in heat pumps into new builds. And they said if they did that, it would cost them about an extra £5,000 per house. This is on houses which are set to sell for in excess of £500,000. But because it was going to cost them an extra 5,000, they weren't going to do it. So they decided not to put in heat pumps into brand new houses, so they can save £5,000 on the build. And until we get some proper control of the developers, I don't think we're actually going to get very far.
Well, I haven't had a chance to read the link yet that David put in to the 2025 Future Home Standard and how it will impact residential real estate. But I hope that this is going to be a sort of slowly, step-by-step, catchy monkey approach, that as more and more people at our level, at the council level, are saying we're not prepared to put up with the level of regulation that you're giving us, national government, then we can try and persuade the national government to change. Of course, they're getting bombarded by comments from all sides. So you've got the builders all saying, no, we can't do that. And you've got all the council saying, actually, that's what we want. And somehow the government will steer through the middle, if that's their usual way of doing things. But I think what we have to do is just chip away gradually at each of these issues until we get them to get to the point where we're trying to get to. Cara, please.
Well, just to add to that, I think it's really important that we do lobby government to ensure that these things are embedded, because the noise from the volume house builders, which have been manipulating for decades on policy around building, have got the stronger voice over others because we're not shouting loud enough what we expect and want. And that also goes to kind of customer base, so that people looking to buy houses demand that these are in place. Because when you're looking as well at the amount of government funding that's available to put heat pumps in, it seems somewhat insane that we're not putting them in at the beginning for them, then the government to pay for them to retrofit them.
Yes, well, I think you're right that that was why I was concentrating on the neighborhood plan, saying that we have to get the standards that we require there, and then sort of hopefully it'll take over the whole country if all parishes get to their neighborhood plans requiring those sorts of standards. We'll get there.
The only issue with that is they have to be ratified against the council's plan, and as depends where you are in the country, Somerset hasn't written one for the new county-wide version, but the districts do exist. It will probably go to appeal, and the government may outrule those sort of requirements because it doesn't meet within those kind of local planning frameworks.
Yes, and that's when you throw the government out. I mean, that's how it works in a democracy, isn't it? You've got to just keep piling on the pressure.
Which goes full circle back to the fact that we need to put these requests in from town, parish and councils to say that it needs to be at the NPPF, the national planning policy part, to ensure that Persimmon Homes can't take you to court against it. which has happened numerous times around trying to go above and beyond for putting in more eco-friendly housing development requirements. Because as you said before, those big volume house builders have got a lot of money behind them, and councils don't be able to fight them in court.
And they also go a long way to funding the Conservative Party.
Quite, and that I wasn't going to say that in particular, but that comes back to the lobbying point, that they have got the strength and the money to support the government, and that's why they're not making the changes happen, because they say, if you're going to force us to do more eco-friendly housing, we won't, and we will stop funding you.
Yeah, can I add to that? Which is, you may or may not know, but the Competition and Markets Authority was looking at freehold and leasehold homes. And then on Wash-Up Day, the last day of the last government, the Freehold and Leasehold Reform Act was passed, but it needed secondary legislation in order to introduce some of the measures in the Act, or most of the measures in the Act. And there was an announcement yesterday about what the government's going to do and how they responded to the CMA's investigation. And what they've said is basically, we're going to consult a lot more on a number of things. And it smacks of Angela Rayner having won out over, anything to do with what residents actually need. So I would recommend you all to look out for that, or I can put links in the chat. But we're highly disappointed I'm on a fleasehold estate where all the public ownership, all the public open spaces are privately paid for by those of us who are residents, and the management company that looks after it is on the deeds of our house. So it's an embedded management arrangement. So getting out of that is hopeless. But it is actually NALC, National Association of Local Councils, policy, through their policy committee, through a motion that I put through our local county association, and it got through to NALC, and NALC has passed it into policy, that they are pro-adoption and against management companies running estates, because anything that you've got that's of shared ownership on such an estate where homes like this are built can add extra charges. So it might be that you're in an affordable home that's designed for low running costs, and then you've got to pay a management company a huge amount for cutting the grass to within an inch of its life and all the other stuff. So we've got to look at this holistically and lobby government, because it won't happen if not, because as you say, at the moment, Angela Rayner needs friends in the building industry to build all these millions of houses she wants building. And I'm not against people having homes, but I am against a lack of thinking that's joined up. Hence putting it on the record now. Thank you. And I have put that link in the chat to the Morton homes.
Thanks, Amanda, very much. Right, we seem to have run out of steam. If nobody else is going to have any comments, let me say thank you very much to everybody. Thank you for joining in, and your comments will, I think, get amplified as we publish them and they get into the search engine and people start looking for these things. So thank you very much for the contributions.
Graham, may I say something before you finish the session? Is that okay? It's Amanda here.
Yes, go ahead, Amanda, please do.
Thank you. This afternoon at 3 o'clock, and I've emailed to you and to Andrew Malafant. I don't know whether it can be sent out on a distribution list, but it's about sustainable tourism. And so it's a 3 o'clock webinar, and it's free. And I think it's via Zoom, if I remember right. So it's just like this, but it's around sustainable tourism and looking at it from an international perspective. So from protests in Venice and over in Mallorca and on I think Canary Islands, etc., through to looking at Bourton-on-the-Water and looking at St. Ives. You know, it's the whole issue of how do we ensure that tourism is welcomed and that we get that friendly economy and a good frictionless tourism alongside residents in a way that is sustainable to our planet as well. And it's how do we distribute and get transport, and it's that looking at that whole thing. So if anybody's interested, I've sent the link to Graham already.
Can you stick it into the chat here, Amanda? You got
I did it from? I might be able to, yes, but as soon as you close this session, of course, I won't have the facility to do that. So
No, I'm hanging on for you, Amanda.
oh, okay, then I'll look it up and see if how quickly I can do this. No pressure.
Exactly.
Right, I've got it. I'm copying it. And then if I come back onto the Zoom, go into the chat.
Whilst we're waiting, could I just ask if anyone has got any idea how we should be going about retrofitting our older houses? I mean, obviously loft insulation, but a lot of people are struggling with either internal or external wall insulation. Getting double or triple glazing in is very expensive. Putting in underfloor heating, very expensive. And even just moving from a combi gas boiler to an air source heat pump is also very expensive and very disruptive if you do it properly. I was wondering if anyone had any sort of good ideas.
Yes, Stuart, it's going to be quite a journey, I think. And it all starts with getting a good retrofit plan done on your property, because every property is different and the recommendations will be specific to the build type, how it's been constructed, how it's been used, how many people live in it, how much water is heated, and what impact that will have on water vapor. You have to have a whole design on to improve ventilation. But the most important thing is start with insulation. But this is what's being recommended, is that it is definitely worth the value of having a retrofit plan done to look at the whole house retrofit timeline, and it will then tell you what is required for your home in terms particular of whether it should be internal or external insulation. It will depend on who your neighbours are, but there's a lot of work going on to also look at delivering it rather than individual homes, how we can wrap it up, particularly in terraces, to encourage the whole terrace to get involved, because then external insulation makes a lot more sense. But what's very interesting is, having looked into this for quite some time, that what's most important is the remedial works that may be required to start off with. That if you're in a particularly damp part of the world, like we are in the southwest, quite often it could be as simple as starting off by just removing some of the water ingress that occurs in older homes. Will have an immediate energy saving effect, because once you've dried out the walls, in order to heat it and keep it warm, it leaves a lot less energy. I've put in the chat as well a link to CSE. They've done a lot of work around retrofit. There's a retrofit hub as well for national, trying to bring together loads of examples and solutions and working with installers, because the other issue, of course, is who's out there who's got the skill set to be able to deliver that outside of the social housing sector.
And who's going to pay for all this?
Well, and there's a huge debate. I say fossil fuel companies should be paying for it personally, but that's my own input for that.
Who should be paying for it?
It's the fossil fuel industry who've destroyed the
yeah,
climate, who are making millions upon millions of pounds in profits and not really being tied to doing this kind of remedial work that's required. So that's what I think we should be asking the money from. But it is a good question, is how and who is supposed to be paying for it, because at the moment funding that's available for the low income households, although very important, means that the majority of people in society aren't accessing funds to be able to deliver that.
Yeah.
And it's so important on so many levels, not just about reducing energy and carbon, but about health and well-being and climate adaptation, which is part of the retrofit delivery. If you go to the PassivHaus 2035 requirements, which is the guidance to do your retrofit properly.
Thanks, Cara.
But yes,
Brilliant.
more campaigning and lobbying. That's what I say.
Yes, thank you. Moving on to Frank, please. You're muted, Frank.
Thank you. One of the things that I'm up in Scotland, so I'm always conscious it's a slightly different environment and context, but I think it will apply to most of you as well. We're locally trying to look at whether or not we can establish a retrofit hub and these are usually based around community interest companies or co-ops. And the idea is to bring together the householders, the assessors, because the EPC is the wrong assessment tool. So you know, I got an EPC plus to do the assessment, as Kara is saying, that's focused around an individual house, and then by doing it as communities, we're a number of rural villages, you hopefully will find similar house types across the villages to produce an economy of scale for the contractors. And again, ideally, if you can get it right, the contractors and the assessors will be local people rather than getting, for us it's Glasgow and Stirling are the nearest big towns, rather than constantly feeding their pipeline. We can get local contractors to take on apprentices and create an aspect of community wealth building. So again, I don't know, I know, Cara, you've talked about the major retrofit hubs that share best practice, but I don't know how sensitive it is down south that there are local retrofit hubs that are just designed for smaller geographies. I can put a couple of links to ones in Glasgow and Aberdeen that, in case anyone's interested.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the more that goes on locally, you're helping local employment, you're keeping the money in the area. And I think that if you're presenting the contractors with a whole bunch of houses that need to be done, then they ought to be able to get their prices down because there's no sales and marketing costs involved. So hopefully.
The other one I was interested that didn't crop up, and I think what we're seeing it as a sort of problem here. When we talked about new builds and there were some really inspirational things that we're seeing, we've still got an embedded issue here of people saying, but we're a conservation village. We don't want those sorts of things. I mean, we had I always fell out with colleagues in a community council meeting because they were wanting to use an example of a near passive house wooden build that's on the edge of the village as an example of why we need tighter planning conditions to stop people building eyesores like that. So and I'm assuming that in places like the Cotswolds, Amanda, or in the Southwest, that must be an issue too, that we've still got people in community councils or people involved in planning saying, no, we want to preserve the look and feel of a mid-18th century village, regardless of what the impact is on energy use and carbon.
Yep.
Can I come back on that, because my hand was next as well, but I would love to follow on Frank. Yes, absolutely. However, I'm delighted to say that between the Cotswold National Landscape, which is next down from National Park, it's like AONB status, but we're huge. So we cover 6 county councils and all the planning authorities within that. And we've actually got a position statement and some agreements and have been pulling all in the same direction, so that we are now much more welcoming on listed buildings, for example, in conservation areas, of having solar panels or wind or whatever and we are looking at how we can achieve net zero within a conserve and enhance statutory requirement of the AONB. So we are joining up together and all aligning about a common vision. And I think that's where the AONB provided the leadership. It's not that any one county individually needed our input to have leadership. It's more about the joining up of it, so that where we've got a common landscape, i.e. the Cotswolds, for example, that we have conserved and enhanced, and that we can allow it to be a living environment, because people have got to live and be healthy. They've got to go to work, they've got to get around, as well as looking at the area and appreciating and maintaining it. But I want to go back to when I was living much closer to you, Frank, up in Northumberland. I was living in a 1760s mill, a water mill, and it was built on a bank, so only a slight incline, but it means that you walk in from the front into your house on that level, but at the back you've got to walk up some steps to get into the house, and quite a few of them, because in the back the animals slept underneath in the byre. So with them being underneath the house, they heated the rest of the house. So it's designed around having wouldn't we all like to retrofit our houses to have the animals underground, giving their heat upwards? And then we've got things like, I had to become an expert in lime mortar and how to look after it, because in the 60s, when it had been converted into flats, and a different sort of living. It was living for the first time in what was an industrial building for several hundred years, or industrial and agricultural. It was then about what do we rip off that modern builders have come in and completely destroyed how that living, breathing building worked, creating me all the worst condensation and damp and mold, and I pretty much had to strip it out. But then where the water wheel was, over to one side of the property, sorry, I'm hesitating because there's some, can I keep going? Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
It's not up mine. So somebody had to make sure that each of the 3 flats that the mill conversion was put into, each had a bit of garden space. They actually built the garden up a whole story on one side, so all the water came running into the house. So then, rather than deal with that, they then tanked the side of the wall with tanking to try and waterproof it. And I had to kind of undo a whole load of a century of bad building before I could even start to think about retrofit. So it very much is unique to each, but I like the idea of keeping it local, because local builders and local people going back 2 or 3 centuries knew the history of the building and knew what had been done to it, so they could help undo it and make it good.
Yep.
But that
Thank
was
you.
Northumberland, right on the edge of National Park and right on Hadrian's Wall. And it was built out of Hadrian's Wall stone.
Good. Let me just say thank you to Cara for all of your contributions in the chat. Some really nice stuff there. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Sorry, I'm running out of voice.
Graham, could we have a future session on retrofit?
Absolutely. I'll try and find someone to do it for us. Yeah.
We've almost had that session from Cara and everybody else, but it would be lovely to have a formal session on it.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, I'd just say I'd like to echo what Amanda found. The house I'm in at the moment is probably 13th century, owned by a local farmer for quite some time. And he had a knack of repairing the lime mortar with cement, which of course led to rotting of the sole plates and this, that, and the other. So when I moved in, had a proper building inspection done. They said everything was fine. When we actually came to work on it, we took off the concrete, and I say found a lot of the wood was rotten. So we had to recover the whole house, but it gave me the opportunity to get sheep's wool insulation into the cavity and do quite a lot of other sort of good things as well. We've got some underfloor insulation, obviously good roof insulation. So it was a mixed blessing, but it was an expensive procedure.
yeah, well, I think that just enhances Cara's view that every single house is going to be different and you're going to run into different issues. But I'm very interested in Mike Bundot's comment about the difference it's made to upgrading his house to sort of passive standards, and his energy costs had dropped accordingly. So nice to hear. If we don't have any more comments, I'm going to say thank you all very much for your.
I do. I always have a comment.
Okay,
Just before we go.
Go for it, Cara. Yes.
I just think it's, you know, those conversations we've had in the chat about what people have done are the most important in order to inspire other people. So if there is a way that we can capture it, something we're trying to do in Somerset is by sort of filming open homes events where people who've done elements of retrofit can kind of talk through their experience and what the benefits are, because only then will people really realize why it's so important that they need to do it, because it makes a home better places to live. And that's the main key story of which we need to be transcribing.
Yeah, I'll get some records of that into the Great Collaboration knowledge base, Cara, because as you say, I'll talk to Mike and see if he'd like to do sort of a presentation on what he's done in his house and what the impact has been. And then we can spread that around. But you're right. And I like the idea of people coming into your house and taking a look for themselves.
Yeah, which is now, you
Yeah,
know,
it's easier
open
to-
homes have been popular for decades, but particularly looking at retrofit now, I think it's going to make a huge difference in peer-to-peer to want them to do something similar.
And can I add, because I did something like that we had open mill, because there was a mills association that had a northern and a southern branch in England, and people came to my mill to have a look, and they were able to answer a lot of questions for me. So it's a bit like Time Team. So if you're in the middle of a retrofit or really want to do something, opening it up to others who've already done it to come and help you. So it's not just the after the
It works
event,
both
it can be,
ways.
yes, yeah. I found it incredibly helpful for me.
Good.
Great, Amanda, well done.
Thank you. Well, thank you all very much for your time. Let me give a special best wishes to you, Cara, for your end of the whatever happens in Somerset. Good luck. And I do hope that we'll see you again. Thank you for your contributions all. Take care.
Okay.
Yes, thanks.
Bye.
And thanks. Bye.